9 o'clock in the evening, April 11th, 1945. Kanoya Naval Air Base lies wrapped in silence. With the next morning's sortie drawing near, the records describe a taut, drawn-out tension settling over the entire base. Kanoya was, at this time, the largest naval base from which special attack sorties were flown. At headquarters, the roster of the 12 men set to sortie the next morning was being checked, carefully, name by name. The unit leader received the sortie order from the 5th Air Fleet in silence. At 9:30 in the evening, 12 special attack pilots formed up in front of the barracks. Sortie at 7:25 the next morning. The target the sea east of Okinawa, so the unit leader told them. The young pilot's expression, the post-war testimony of a comrade records, was astonishingly calm. His comrades too kept their faces still, but their eyes wavered, just slightly. At the order to dismiss, the men returned to their quarters in silence. In the corridor, the testimony of a post-war survivor tells us, only the heavy sound of boots could be heard. Back in his room, the young pilot sat down at his desk and began to prepare to write his last letter. The moment he spread out the paper and took up the brush is said to have been the heaviest of all. In the last letters of Navy Ensign Ichitsu Hayashi, the opening words, "Dear Mother," appear again and again. "Mother, I want to see you. I want to talk with you." Words like these were a thread running through many of the last letters. The pressure of the brush sometimes faltered, and the characters grew uneven, so the testimony of bereaved families tells us. He is said to have crumpled and thrown away spoiled sheets of paper again and again. When the letter was finished, the words "to my parents" were written on the front. The custom of the lock of hair grew out of an assumption that no body would return to the family. The trimmed lock of hair was placed into a small box of plain white wood, the records tell us. Next he clipped his nails, and the 3 keepsakes, the letter, the hair, and the nails, were complete. For a special attack pilot, these were the last keepsakes that could ever be delivered to his family. That panorama of the base, seen earlier, in each one of those buildings perhaps a last letter was being written. At midnight, a special ration supper had been prepared. The moment the unit leader received that order, it could be argued, the fate of his men was already sealed. At midnight, the young pilot purified himself in the base bathhouse. That silence may not have been resolve at all, but numbness, so the post-war testimony seems, perhaps, to suggest. Having set his keepsakes on the desk, the young pilot lay down for roughly 2 hours of sleep. Whether he slept at all, even the post-war testimony of his family is divided. In the next room, the records tell us, his comrades too lay down upon their bedding. The unit leader sat at his desk, gazing at the service records of all 12 of his men. At 3 in the morning, a final sortie confirmation telegram arrived from the 5th Air Fleet. In April, Kanoya remained in complete darkness even past 3 in the morning. At 4 o'clock precisely, the Reveille bugle rang out across the base. At the bugle, the young pilot woke in an instant and rose from his bedding. His comrades rose at almost the same moment and began to dress in silence. In the corridor, the heavy sound of boots had begun, once again, to echo. Plunging his face into cold water at the wash basin, the young pilot brought his mind to a clear edge. The moment of facing himself in the mirror is said to have weighed especially heavily. Shaving, too, was part of the ritual of grooming before a sortie. He straightened his collar and cuffs and refastened his decorations into their appointed places. Many pilots, it is said, tucked a family photograph inside the lining of their flight helmets. At 10 minutes to 5 in the morning, the 12 men made their way to the mess hall. In the mess hall, a special ration of festive red rice and sea bream had been laid out. Sea bream had long been served as a dish of celebration for those setting out to war. As he ate, the young pilot may, perhaps, have been calling to mind the faces of his family. Even as he ate, the unit leader quietly watched each one of his 12 men. The keepsakes on the desk had, by this hour, already become the things that would be left behind. The pressing of palms together after the meal was also a mourning for the senior pilots who had fallen before them. At 5:30, the men left the mess hall and made their way to the send-off ceremony. The men who delivered the orders, too, may have lain awake, thinking of those they had to send. Beside the runway, the mechanics were carrying out the final inspection of all 5 Zeros. In the dim light of dawn, the 5 Zeros, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, stood quietly in line. That Reveille bugle may, for these men, have been the last sound that would ever wake them. At 6 in the morning, the preparations for the send-off ceremony were complete in the square before the barracks. The acting commander of the 5th Air Fleet arrived, wearing white gloves. The 12 men tied white headbands across their brows and formed up once again. Your loyal spirit will remain with the homeland for all time, so the address to the men declared. The young pilot did not move at all. His gaze was set on something far ahead. His comrades, too, held their faces firm as they listened to the address. After the address, the whole unit began to sing the war anthem, Umi Yukaba. Its words, "If I go to the sea, my body shall lie in the water," came from an ancient poem that spoke of death in war. Next, a Japanese sword, inscribed with messages written by the ground crew, was presented to each man. The young pilot received the sword carefully in both hands and bowed deeply. On the scabbard were written the names of the mechanics and the words, "Long fortune in war." The senior mechanic bowed his head deeply and in silence sent the men on their way. The pilots in turn bowed deeply, showing their gratitude to the ground crew. What followed was an ancient farewell rite known as the cup of water. The commander himself poured the sake into each of the white porcelain cups. The unit leader was the first to receive a cup, holding it raised in his right hand. Next, the young pilot came forward and received his cup in both hands. His comrades too came forward in order of age to receive their cups. All 12 men raised their cups, together, before their faces. At the commander's signal, the 12 men drained their cups in a single draught. That orderly square may have been a device built to turn death itself into ceremony. The ceremony over, the men began to walk toward the runway. The path from the square to the runway was roughly 200 meters long. The words of that address, it has been argued, were a device for making death beautiful. The young pilot came to a stop before his own aircraft, tail number KZ-072. His mechanic silently gestured toward the aircraft, inviting him to climb aboard. The singing of Umi Yukaba, it could be said, was a device that affirmed death in war before it had even come. The young pilot gripped the rim of the cockpit with both hands and climbed aboard. Settling into the pilot's seat, he fastened his harness and checked the family photograph one more time. His mechanic stood beside the wing and sent him off with a deep salute. At 7:23 in the morning, the engines of all 5 Zeros started together. The propellers spun up, and white exhaust smoke spread into the morning air. The 5 aircraft moved to the head of the runway and confirmed their order of takeoff. At 7:25 in the morning, led by the leader's aircraft, the 5 Zeros began their takeoff roll. The young pilot's aircraft was the second to begin its roll, gathering speed. After 200 meters of roll, the aircraft left the ground and the nose lifted, just slightly. The 5 aircraft, now airborne, left Kanoya base behind them and turned south. At 1,500 meters, the 5 aircraft formed up into a V formation. The formation climbed gently, bound for a cruising altitude of 4,000 meters. Above the clouds, visibility was wide, an advantage for spotting the approach of enemy fighters. Passing over the Satsunan Islands, the men watched the land drift slowly away behind them. Crossing the Osumi Strait, the aircraft passed into flight entirely over open water. 40 minutes after takeoff, the formation reached its cruising altitude of 4,000 meters. The instrument panel was a vital tool, used constantly to check the fuel remaining and the heading. With his oxygen mask in place, the young pilot kept his eyes fixed steadily to the south. Below them lay a vast sea of cloud, the ocean showing through only here and there. An hour after takeoff, the formation altered course to the south-southwest, toward Okinawa. The act of climbing aboard the aircraft was, for these men, a boarding with no return. Far out across the sea, the shape of the Okinawan main island began to appear. In the sea east of Okinawa, the smoke of a deployed American fleet could be seen. That sound of starting engines may, for the mechanics, have been the sound of aircraft that would never return. A warning of enemy aircraft approaching came over the radio, and the leader answered. At the leader's signal, the 5 aircraft shifted into an open, extended formation. That takeoff roll may have been the last moment these men would ever touch the ground. 4 F-6F Hellcats dove on the formation, pouring machine gun fire into the 5 Zeros. Comrades A and B tried to fight back, still carrying their bombs. Comrade B's aircraft, struck in the engine, fell toward the sea trailing black smoke. The unit leader at once gave the order, commence the attack, each aircraft striking alone. Over the radio came the order, every aircraft, choose your own target. Each aircraft sent toward the fleet behind them the signal, commencing attack. The young pilot sighted an enemy destroyer, 15 degrees below him. The target was an American destroyer in the 2,200-ton class. The young pilot pushed the stick forward and dropped his nose 60 degrees. From 4,000 meters, a dive began at 500 kilometers per hour. In the dive, the young pilot may, for an instant, have called the family photograph to mind. The destroyer threw up a fierce barrage from her 40mm Bofors guns. The young pilot's aircraft broke through the barrage and descended to 500 meters. The American sailors stared up, stunned at the Zero diving toward them. The anti-aircraft gunners kept pulling their triggers, fighting for their lives. The closing distance was 200 meters, already too close for any turn away. In the next instant, a vast flash of explosion ran across the destroyer's midships. A violent pall of smoke rose, and the hull, the records say, broke in two. The young pilot, the records tell us, ended his life in that same explosion. Of the 3 aircraft that remained, 2 more are recorded to have struck another destroyer. A special attack aircraft, still carrying its bomb, may in that moment have been at its most defenseless. At the signal room of Kanoya Base, the final signals from each aircraft had been arriving. The mechanics listened over the radio to the last moments of the aircraft they themselves had sent away. That order may have been the moment that turned them from a formation into solitary deaths. In May of 1945, a box of plain white wood and a last letter were delivered to his family. 80 years on from the war, their keepsakes are preserved today at Chiron and at Kanoya. The last thing he saw, it has been said, may not have been the enemy ship at all, but the shape of his home,